The bracelet was soaked through, dark red, stiff at the edges, the kind of blood that doesn't wash out. Emma pressed it into the unconscious man's palm and curled his fingers around it herself, one by one, slow and deliberate, like she was making a promise neither of them could say out loud. Nobody saw her do it. Nobody was watching. That was the point. 47 minutes later, three men in civilian clothes walked through the emergency entrance of Haller Creek Medical Center at 12:14 in the morning. No badges. No explanation. Body armor under their jackets, weapons she could see the outline of even from the nurse's station. They didn't ask for a doctor. They didn't ask for security. They asked for her. "We need Nurse Vasquez, right now." Before this story goes any further, if you've never been here before, hit subscribe. Not for the algorithm. Because the stories we tell on this channel go places most people aren't brave enough to follow. And you don't want to be 3 episodes behind when this one lands. Hit the like button too. And drop a comment. Tell me your city, your country, wherever in the world you're watching from right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Because stories like Emma's, they deserve to go everywhere. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The fluorescent lights in Bay 7 had been flickering for 11 days. Emma Vasquez had filed the maintenance request twice, once through the digital portal that nobody read, and once on paper that she'd slipped under the facility's manager's door at the end of a double shift. Both requests had disappeared into whatever void swallowed every problem at Haller Creek Medical Center that wasn't bleeding visibly and screaming loud enough for an administrator to hear it. So she worked under the flicker. She'd worked under worse. It was a Thursday in early November, and the ER had been the particular kind of busy that didn't allow for sitting, not a mass casualty, not a flood of trauma, just a relentless grinding stream of chest pain, head lack, abdominal cramping, one hypoglycemic episode in a man who'd been brought in from a bus stop at 3 in the afternoon, a kid with a broken radius from a skateboard fall, 2 overdoses before 7 p.m. The kind of shift where you didn't eat and you didn't complain and you went home with sore feet and a dull headache, and you did it again tomorrow. Emma had been doing it for 6 years. She was 33 years old, 5'4", with dark hair she kept in a low bun that had started unraveling by noon most days. She wasn't glamorous. She wasn't loud. She had the kind of face that people forgot in waiting rooms and remembered later, when they needed her. When something was going wrong and she was already there, gloved, moving, 2 steps ahead of the problem, which was where she always was. Most of the senior nursing staff at Haller Creek didn't particularly like her. This wasn't a secret. It wasn't even subtle. Deborah Wills, the charge nurse for nights, a thick-armed woman with 17 years at this hospital and a personality that had calcified somewhere around year 9, had made it clear during Emma's 3rd week that she ran her floor a specific way and didn't need anyone coming in with outside ideas. Outside ideas in this context meant anything Emma suggested. Emma had proposed a faster triage protocol for penetrating trauma. Deborah had printed out the hospital's existing protocol and left it on Emma's locker without a word. That was the dynamic. Emma learned to be quiet about what she knew. What she knew was considerable. She'd done 4 years in the Army before nursing school. Not administrative, not logistics. She'd been a combat medic attached to infantry units during 2 overseas rotations, and she'd kept people alive in conditions that the ER at Haller Creek would have considered unworkable. Improvised tourniquets, cracked chest compressions in the dirt, airway management in the back of a vehicle going 60 miles an hour over roads that barely qualified as roads. She'd carried wounded soldiers to extraction points on her own back. She'd watched people die that she couldn't save and gone back to work the next morning because there was no other option. She didn't talk about it. It wasn't modesty, exactly. It was more that she'd found talking about it didn't change anything. The people who needed to know already knew. The people who didn't were going to think what they thought regardless. Vasquez. Deborah appeared at the nurse's station with a clipboard, not looking up. The John Doe in Trauma 2 is being moved to the ICU. Attending wants a nursing handoff completed before the transfer. I can take it. Deborah looked up then. The expression on her face was the one Emma had cataloged over 6 years. Not quite contempt, something just below it. The look you gave the person doing the job you didn't think they were capable of doing. I'll have Martinez do it. Martinez is with the post-op in 6. A pause. The clipboard came down slightly. Fine. Vasquez. but I want the documentation clean. Dr. Okafor's notes are a mess, and I'm not spending my morning untangling an incomplete transfer chart. It'll be clean. She didn't wait for a response. Trauma 2 had been curtained off since 2 in the afternoon, when the ambulance had brought him in. Emma had seen the initial triage from a distance. Male, appeared to be mid-30s, no identification, severe internal trauma, possible blast concussion, a laceration along the left temple that had bled badly. The paramedics had been terse in a way that was different from the usual terse. They'd answered questions and then they'd left very quickly, which was not standard. Usually the crew lingered. Paperwork, coffee, a few minutes off their feet. These two had been out the door in 4 minutes. The patient had been stabilized over the following hours. 2 surgeons had gone in and come back out looking satisfied but tight-mouthed. Dr. Okafor, who ran nights in the ICU, had personally overseen the post-op monitoring. The man had been sedated, intubated briefly, extubated before 7. He was breathing on his own now, but unconscious. The deep, quiet kind of unconscious that was either very good or very bad, depending on what was underneath it. Emma pulled back the curtain and checked the chart before she looked at him. 36 years old, listed as John Doe pending identification. Blood type O negative. No next of kin on file. No emergency contacts. The intake notes from the paramedics said simply, found at scene, circumstances unclear, law enforcement aware, which meant nothing and everything simultaneously. She looked at him then. He was big. Even prone in the hospital bed with tubes and monitoring leads crossing his chest, she could see that he was built like someone who'd spent years earning it. Not gym-built, work-built. The kind of frame that came from carrying weight over distance for a long time. He had a jaw that hadn't been shaved in probably 5 days, and there was old scarring on his forearms, the kind that wasn't surgical. His hands, resting on the blanket, were the hands of someone who used them hard. Emma did her assessment with the focus she always brought to it. Vitals were stable. O2 sat at 96. The intracranial pressure monitor read within acceptable range. She checked the IV lines, the drains, the monitor leads. Everything Okafor's team had done was solid. She made her notes, systematic, thorough. Then she pulled a chair to the bedside. This was the part Deborah had once, directly and in front of 2 other nurses, called Vasquez's weird thing. Sitting with unconscious patients, talking to them. Emma had not explained herself. She'd simply kept doing it. She'd learned it the hard way. Not in a classroom, not in a textbook. She'd learned it in a field hospital outside a small city she wasn't allowed to name, sitting with a 22-year-old kid named Darren who'd lost half the blood in his body and shouldn't have been alive and was. He'd been unconscious for 6 days. She'd talked to him because there was nothing else she could do. When he came back, he told her he remembered her voice. He didn't know what she'd said. He remembered the sound of it. She'd been doing it ever since. "Hey," she said, keeping her voice low, level. "My name's Emma. I'm your nurse tonight. You've been through a lot today, and your body's doing the right thing, just resting, getting stable. You're safe here." She checked the pressure reading again. "I don't know who you are. That's fine. You don't have to be anybody right now. You just have to keep breathing." She adjusted his blanket. His left hand was turned out, palm slightly open, and she noticed something she hadn't caught in the initial assessment, a thin strip of knotted cord on his wrist. Military paracord, the specific weave she knew, worn smooth with age. Someone had already cut away most of his clothing and personal effects, but whoever had done his intake had missed this or left it deliberately. She left it where it was. She came back at 10, and again at midnight. By the 3rd visit, she'd brought a small cup of coffee that she didn't drink because she forgot about it. She sat with him for 20 minutes and talked about nothing in particular. The weather, which had turned cold, the fact that there was a vending machine on the 2nd floor that still sold those orange crackers she'd survived on during her deployment. She talked about small things. That was the point. Small things were proof the world was still going. The ICU was quiet. The night staff was minimal. The unit had 4 occupied beds, and Emma was covering a float shift for a colleague who'd called out sick, which meant she was technically in unfamiliar territory, which she'd reported when she arrived, and which had been acknowledged with a nod by the charge nurse and then promptly forgotten. At 12:43, she was writing her notes at the station when she heard the elevator. She looked up out of habit. 3 men came off the elevator and into the ICU corridor. Civilian clothes, jeans, jackets, one of them in a gray long sleeve, but civilian the way she'd learned to read civilian in her early 20s, which meant not actually civilian at all. They moved wrong for civilians. Too controlled, too aware of the space, the exits, the lines of sight. They weren't rushing, but they covered ground the way people did when they'd been trained not to waste movement. The one in front was maybe 40, with a short-cropped beard going gray at the edges. He looked at Emma from 15 feet away and she felt it. Not threat, exactly. Assessment. The same way you looked at terrain. "Nurse Vasquez?" he said. She set her pen down. "Who's asking?" He stopped 2 feet from the desk. Up close she could see the watch band on his right wrist. A specific type, military issued. And his hands. Same as the man in the room behind her. "My name is Dolan. These are my colleagues." He didn't offer more than that. "We're here for the patient you brought to the ICU this evening." "I didn't bring him. I took over his care for the shift." "Yes, ma'am. We know." Something in the way he said it. Not rude, not warm, careful. "We'd like to see him. Visiting hours ended at 9. I understand that. And the unit has a restricted access policy for unidentified patients." "I understand that too." He reached into his jacket. Emma's hand moved 3 inches before she caught herself. Old reflex, nothing she could stop. And Dolan noticed it. He paused very deliberately before pulling out a folded document and setting it on the desk without sliding it across. She looked at it. Federal ID. The kind with the right lamination and the right seals that took considerable effort to fake. It identified him as part of a liaison unit that Emma didn't fully recognize but whose parent organization she did. She looked back up at him. "He's unconscious," she said. "Yes, ma'am. We're aware." "Then what exactly are you expecting to accomplish?" Something shifted in the man's face. Not softness. That wasn't the word. Something more like the wall coming down half an inch. "We just need to know he's not alone tonight." The ICU was silent. Down the hall, one of the monitors registered a brief alarm and silenced itself. Emma picked up the ID, looked at it properly, handed it back. She stood. One at a time in the room. Anything that looks like equipment, it stays in the hall. If his pressure changes, you clear the room immediately and without argument. "Understood," Dolan said. "I'll go in first." She didn't ask permission. She walked back to the room and they followed her. Inside, she checked his vitals before she turned to Dolan, who had come in alone while the other two waited in the hall. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the man in it with an expression Emma had seen before. Not grief exactly. Something more exhausted than grief. The face of someone who'd already been afraid for a long time and was now on the other side of the worst of it. "His name isn't on any file I've been given," Emma said quietly. "It won't be," Dolan said. "Not on anything you'd have access to." "Then I'm going to keep calling him John." "That works." A pause. "He's responsive to voice?" "No confirmed evidence yet. But in my experience, that's not always the right question." Dolan looked at her for a moment. "You former military?" She hadn't mentioned it. She never mentioned it here. "Why?" "The way you carry yourself." He said it without any particular emphasis, like he was noting a temperature reading. "Not an insult." "I know it's not." She adjusted the drip rate by 2 clicks, checked the monitor. "He's stable. His brain activity is within acceptable range. Whether he comes back in 2 days or 2 weeks, that part isn't something medicine determines." "What does it determine it?" She looked at the man in the bed, at the rough hands, at the paracord bracelet she'd left on his wrist, at the face that was someone's face, someone who mattered to these men standing in the hallway in civilian clothes at 1 in the morning. "Whether he has something to come back to," she said. Dolan didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had dropped slightly. "He doesn't have family, not anymore. His team is—" A pause that held something. "Most of them are here, in the hall." Emma nodded once. She looked at the paracord bracelet again, the specific knot. "I'll make sure he's not alone," she said. "We'll be rotating through. We'd like to be on the approved visitor list. I'll handle the paperwork myself. Come back in 20 minutes. I'll have it cleared." She walked back to the nurse's station, aware of the weight of Dolan's attention on her back. Aware of the two other men in the hall who watched her with the same quality of stillness she recognized from men who'd spent time in places where stillness was survival. She made the call to the overnight administrator, and she cleared the list, and then she went back to her documentation. At 1:15, she got up to check another patient. At 1:40, she walked back past the room and looked through the small window in the door. Dolan was sitting in the chair she'd pulled to the bedside earlier. He wasn't talking. He was just sitting there, with his elbows on his knees, and his eyes were on his teammate's face. Emma went back to her station. At 2:30 in the morning, Deborah Wills appeared. She wasn't on shift. She was in street clothes, jeans, a dark coat, and she walked into the ICU with the proprietary stride of someone who considered themselves above being questioned about their presence anywhere in the building. She went directly to the nurse's station and looked at Emma over the counter. "I got a call," Deborah said, "from administration. Something about override clearance for unidentified patients?" "Standard protocol," Emma said. "Law enforcement adjacent visitors. I ran it through Jane's." "You ran it through the overnight coordinator without running it through me first." "You're not on shift." Deborah's jaw set. "I'm the charge nurse for this unit. For days and evenings. I'm float coverage for nights. And you're making clearance decisions for a restricted patient. I'm the senior nursing staff present. The visitors have federal identification. The documentation is logged." Emma held Deborah's gaze steadily. "Is there a specific protocol violation you'd like to identify?" The silence that followed was the kind Emma had learned to recognize as Deborah calculating how much force she had in a given situation and coming up short. She recalibrated visibly. "I want to review the chart in the morning," Deborah said. "It'll be available. And whoever these visitors are, I want it on record that I was not consulted. I'll note your concern." Emma turned back to her monitor. Deborah didn't leave immediately. She stood there for a moment that was meant to establish something. Authority, maybe, or the reminder that this conversation wasn't over. Then she walked back to the elevator. Emma watched her go. She'd had supervisors like Deborah before. Not here. In the Army, where the hierarchy was clearer and the consequences of certain behavior were more specific. The principle was the same. There were people whose power depended on other people not knowing too much. When the other people started knowing things, the power rearranged itself, and that rearrangement was uncomfortable. Emma made a notation in her log about the supervisory inquiry. Time, content, resolution. She did it calmly, precisely, the way she did everything. At 3 in the morning, she looked up to see Dolan standing in the hallway outside the ICU entrance. He wasn't waiting for anything. His posture said that. He just seemed like he needed somewhere to stand that wasn't inside the room. She went to the door. "You doing okay?" she asked. He glanced at her. The guard that was always in that face came down another degree. "Not much." "Enough." "Not really." "That's honest." Seemed like the right time for it. She leaned against the doorframe. The corridor was empty, the floor quiet, the city outside the windows doing whatever cities did at 3 in the morning. "You can't tell me who he is." "No." "Or what happened?" "No." "But he matters." Dolan looked at the floor for a moment. "He matters to a lot of people who'll never be able to say so publicly." He said it very quietly, like it was something he'd been carrying around for a while and was setting down briefly just to feel what it weighed. People whose lives he made possible, not metaphorically. Emma didn't say anything. "He'd been in the field a long time," Dolan continued. "Too long, maybe. But there wasn't anyone else who could do what he did. So he kept going." He exhaled. "He's got no one to go home to. That's not classified. It's just his life. That's a hard life. It's the life he chose." "That doesn't make it less hard." Dolan looked at her. Whatever assessment he'd been running since they'd met in the ICU corridor an hour and a half ago seemed to reach some kind of conclusion. "Why do you talk to him?" "The unconscious patients." She considered the honest answer. "Because consciousness isn't all or nothing," she said. "You know that, probably. And because, I don't know, because it costs nothing and it might matter. And most of what I can offer in this job is things that cost nothing and might matter." He looked at her for a long moment. "What unit?" She held his gaze. 68 whiskey, 2 rotations. He nodded slowly. The nod of recognition, not confirmation. He hadn't needed her to say it to already have the picture mostly assembled. "He's going to have a long recovery," she said. "I know. And he's going to need people around him. I know that too." She straightened, pushed the door. "Get some coffee. There's a machine on 2 that isn't horrible. Come back in an hour." "Yes, ma'am," Dolan said. Not formal, honest, the 2 words carrying more weight than their size. She went back inside. By 5:30, the unit had started its early morning rhythm. The quiet shuffle before the day shift arrived, the exchange of information, the handoffs beginning to build. Emma was documenting her final hour of notes when the man in the bed made a sound. Not a word. Not anything close to coherent. A low, strained sound, the kind that came from somewhere below the surface of consciousness, involuntary, something the body did when the mind was navigating its way back from very far away. She was in the room in 4 seconds. She checked the monitors, pressure steady, sat unchanged, cardiac rhythm clean. She leaned in close. "Hey," she said, low and level, the same way she'd been speaking to him for hours. "It's Emma. You're at Haller Creek Medical Center. You're safe. Your people are here." His hand moved, just barely, a small flexion of his fingers on the blanket. Not a grip. More like a response, like something at the bottom of a well, hearing a sound from the surface and reaching toward it. She placed her hand over his, lightly. "You've got people right outside this room. You understand me? You're not alone." The flexion stopped. His face stayed still. But the monitors were steady, and the pressure was unchanged, and Emma stood there for another minute before she took her hand back and went to get Dolan. He was in the hall, in the same spot, with a coffee cup going cold in his hand. Both his teammates had gone to get a few hours of sleep an hour ago. He'd stayed. "Something happened," Emma said. He was inside the room before she finished the sentence. She showed him the monitor readings. She explained what she'd heard, what she'd seen. Clinical, specific, no dramatization. Dolan stood at the bedside and his hand went to his teammate's shoulder, the way soldiers did. Not gentle exactly, but present. Real. "He moved," Emma said. "His hand. It was a response." Dolan's jaw was tight. He nodded once without looking away from the bed. "What does that mean?" he said. "It means something's working," she said. "It means there's more in there than the scans have been able to tell us." She paused. "It means keep talking to him." Dolan cleared his throat. "Right. I'm serious." "I know you are." He exhaled through his nose, and she saw him, just for a second, just in the way his shoulders changed, not as the controlled, careful man who'd walked off the elevator 5 hours ago, but as someone who'd been afraid for a very long time, for someone he would never say he loved, but clearly did. "I'm not good at this part." "Nobody is," Emma said. "Do it anyway." She left them alone. She was finishing her charting when the day shift started filtering in at 6:15. She gave her hand off to the oncoming nurse. Thorough, detailed, every change documented. The man in the room with the paracord bracelet and no name on file was the last thing she covered. "He had visitors overnight," she said. "Federal ID cleared by administration. They're on the approved list now. His neuroresponse shows some promising baseline indicators." The oncoming nurse, a woman named Priya, who Emma liked for the single reason that she asked good questions, looked at the chart carefully. "No ID still?" "No." "But his people are here." "Yes," Emma said. "His people are here." She gathered her things. She was almost to the elevator when Deborah appeared, now in scrubs, now officially on shift, holding a coffee and a clipboard with the particular posture of someone who had been waiting. "We need to talk about last night," Deborah said. Emma pressed the elevator button. "My documentation is complete. Everything is logged." "You cleared a restricted patient for civilian visitors without federal identification, verified, logged, approved by the overnight coordinator." The elevator arrived. Emma stepped in. "If you have a specific protocol concern, it'll need to be in writing. My charting is available for review." She let the doors close on whatever Deborah was about to say. Outside, the parking lot was pale with early light, the kind of cold, flat dawn that November did in this part of the state. Emma sat in her car for a moment before she started it, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting with the specific exhaustion of a night that had been more than a shift. She thought about the hand moving against the blanket. She thought about Dolan's face when he'd said, "Not really." She thought about a field hospital outside a city she still couldn't name, and a 22-year-old named Darren, and the things she'd learned about voices and what they could reach. She started her car. Her phone buzzed as she was pulling out of the lot. A number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go, then didn't. She answered. "Nurse Vasquez." The voice was not Dolan's. It was different, older, with a particular clipped precision that she recognized from a very specific register of military command. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Ames, U.S. OCOM liaison. I understand you provided care for one of ours last night." Emma said nothing immediately. "I'd like to speak with you," Ames said. "Not about protocol. Personally." A pause. "We've been trying to figure out what his chances are, and I've just spoken with Dolan." Another pause, waited in a way she couldn't yet read. "He says you're the reason we even needed to have that conversation." The parking lot was empty. The morning light sat on everything gray and cold. Emma's hand was steady on the wheel. "I'm just his nurse," she said. "Yes, ma'am," said Lieutenant Colonel Ames. "That's what Dolan said you'd say." The line was quiet for 3 seconds. "He also said you were 68 whiskey, 2 rotations." A beat. "I'd like to know where." Emma sat with the phone against her ear in a parking lot that had gone very still, and she did not answer right away. That was the thing about certain kinds of questions, the ones that came loaded with context you hadn't agreed to carry yet. Where? The word was simple. The answer wasn't, because the answer meant explaining things she hadn't explained to anyone at Holler Creek in 6 years, and those were things she'd put down deliberately, the way you put down something heavy when you've carried it long enough and the carrying isn't serving anyone anymore. "Sir," she said finally, "with respect, that's not information I typically share." A pause. Not offended. Considering. "Understood," Ames said. "I'm not asking for a debrief. I'm asking because what Dolan described this morning, the way you talked to him, the way you read the situation, the hand response you caught, that's not something you learn in a nursing program." "I learned a lot of things in nursing programs." "I don't doubt it." Another pause, and this one had something in it she couldn't quite place. Not pressure, not quite respect. Something calibrating. "Nurse Vasquez, I'm going to be in Holler Creek this afternoon. I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee, off the record, completely informal." Emma looked at the dashboard. The fuel gauge was at a quarter tank, and she'd been meaning to fill it for 3 days. Small things. The world's still going. "I'm back on shift tonight," she said. "I know. Early evening then, 4 o'clock. He named a coffee place 2 blocks from the hospital that she'd been to exactly once. "You don't have to tell me anything. I'd mostly like to say thank you in person." She should have said no. She almost did. 4 o'clock, she said instead, and ended the call. She sat for another 30 seconds. Then she drove to the gas station on the corner and filled the tank, because that was the next thing, and she'd long ago learned to keep moving through the next things when the big things were too large to look at directly. She slept 4 hours and woke with the particular groggy clarity of someone whose body knew how to recover fast, even when the mind wanted more time. She made coffee. She ate something that passed for breakfast. She sat at her kitchen table and looked out at the November street without really seeing it. She thought about the man in the ICU with the paracord bracelet and no name. She thought about his hand moving. She'd been a nurse long enough to know that small movements in unconscious patients meant different things at different stages of recovery. They could be reflexive, could be random neural firing, could be nothing. But they could also be the first evidence of someone finding their way back through a lot of darkness. And Emma had a particular quality of attention when it came to that particular situation. Not hope, exactly, because hope was something you had to manage carefully in this work, but a specific alertness. The alertness of someone who had seen the edge of that darkness themselves. Not from inside it, but from close enough to know its geography. She'd never talked about that with anyone at Holler Creek either. At 3:30, she put on civilian clothes and drove back. The coffee place was the kind of small, independent spot that survived near hospitals by staying open late and keeping the espresso machine serviced. Emma arrived at 3:58 and found Ames already there. A man in his late 50s, lean and upright in the way that didn't leave the body even when it left the uniform. He was in civilian clothes too, but they sat on him the same way Dolan's had sat on Dolan. He stood when she came through the door, which she hadn't expected. Nurse Vasquez. Lieutenant Colonel. Just Ames is fine here. He gestured to the seat across from him. There were 2 coffees already on the table. I ordered you black. Dolan said you took it black. If that's wrong, I'll fix it. It's right. She sat. She wrapped both hands around the cup, not because she was cold, but because it gave her hand something to do that wasn't fidgeting. How's he doing this morning? Stable? No change from your handoff. He studied her for a moment. The neuro team is cautiously optimistic. The phrase they used was better than expected given the mechanism of injury, which apparently is physician for good news. It is, she said, given everything in his chart. He looked at her over his coffee. How much of that chart did you read? Enough to know that whoever he is, he got hit hard, and that whoever treated him before he reached us did a reasonable job of keeping him together for transport. She paused. The surgical repair work was clean for a transfer case. Someone with good hands worked on him before our team got to him. Something shifted in Ames's face. Brief, almost imperceptible. You caught that. It's in the tissue presentation. Most of the surgical team attributed the primary repair to Haller Creek. I know they did. She said it evenly, not as an accusation, just the fact of it. The drain placement and the initial wound management didn't match what our surgeons typically do. It was someone who'd worked in non-standard conditions, probably more than once. Ames set his cup down. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read, and then he said, You said 2 rotations to Dolan. I did. Where? She'd had 7 hours to decide how she felt about this question. She'd landed somewhere that surprised her slightly. Why does it matter to you where specifically? Because the way you work, he said, and what you caught last night, that's a particular kind of trained eye. And I want to understand what shaped it. He paused. Also because he served in the same theater during approximately the same time period as when you would have been deployed, and I keep doing the math. Emma looked at her coffee. I was in the Korengal, she said. Second deployment was in Kunar province. Different sectors on the second one. Ames was very still. What years? She told him. Quietly, matter of fact. She hadn't said those dates out loud in this context for a very long time. He absorbed it. He picked up his cup again. He didn't say anything for a moment, and when he did, his voice was level in a way that took effort. His last deployment before this one included Kunar, 3 years ago. Emma said nothing. I'm not going to tell you his name, Ames said. That's not mine to give, but I want you to understand the scope of what you're looking at, Vasquez, because I think you should know. He leaned forward slightly. The man in that ICU has been responsible for outcomes that most people in this country will never hear about. Operations that didn't get press releases. Things that happened in the dark, over years, that kept certain other things from happening. He stopped. And he is 36 years old, and he has no one to go home to, and the last time he had a conversation with a civilian who wasn't a contractor or a debriefer was... He stopped again. I don't actually know how long. The coffee shop had 2 other customers. A college student with headphones. A woman reading something on a tablet. The everyday world doing its everyday things on the other side of a window. He's not alone now, Emma said. No. Ames looked at her directly. Because you made sure of it. A pause. Dolan told me what you said. About consciousness not being all or nothing. About what it might cost and what it might be worth. It's not a complicated idea. No, but it requires someone who actually believes it enough to do it at 1 in the morning when nobody's watching and no one's keeping score. He paused. Why do you stay at Haller Creek? Honest question. Emma hadn't expected it. She took a moment. Because it's where I am. That's not an answer. It's the true one. She looked at him steadily. I went into the army because I wanted to do something. I came out of the army because the specific thing I was doing there was finished. I went into nursing because it was the skill set I had that could still help people and didn't require anyone to die as part of the process. She paused. Haller Creek isn't a great hospital. It's an adequate one. But adequate hospitals in mid-sized cities still have real patients with real problems. So I stay. Ames looked at her for a long moment. Is it enough? She almost said yes out of habit. She caught it. Not always, but enough isn't a permanent condition. It's a moving target. He nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd been thinking. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the table between them. A challenge coin. Brass and heavy-looking, with markings she recognized and a unit insignia she wasn't entirely familiar with but could contextualize. He would want you to have this, Ames said. When he's back, he'll be able to tell you that himself. But given that we don't know the timeline, I'd rather you have it now. Emma looked at the coin. She didn't pick it up immediately. Challenge coins had a specific meaning in the world she'd come from. They weren't decorative, they were acknowledgement. The particular kind that moved between people who understood what the other had done without needing it, explained. She picked it up, turned it over. She knew what it meant, and she wasn't going to pretend she didn't. Tell Dolan to keep talking to him, she said. I will. Not just presents, actual talking, specific things he'd recognize. Ames looked at her. You think it makes a difference? I know it does, she said. Not with drama, just with the flat certainty of someone who'd watched it work. She put the coin in her jacket pocket, finished her coffee, and went back to work. She walked into Haller Creek at 5:40 to pick up a file she'd left and nearly collided with Dr. Garrison Phelps in the second-floor corridor, which was something she'd been successfully avoiding for going on 3 weeks. Phelps was the head of emergency services, a tall, florid man in his mid-50s who had the specific personality of someone who'd been the smartest person in a lot of rooms early in life and had never fully adjusted to the possibility that this was no longer universally true. He had 3 published papers, 2 of which Emma had read, and 1 of which had made her raise her eyebrows in the direction of this conclusion doesn't entirely follow from this data. He was also, technically, her department head's department head, which put him in a supervisory position over her care decisions in a way that was organizational rather than clinical, which was a distinction Phelps did not typically respect. Vasquez. He stopped. He had a tablet in one hand and the look on his face that meant he'd been waiting to have a specific conversation, and this was the moment for it. I've been trying to reach you. I was off shift, and apparently in a meeting with a military liaison officer this afternoon. He said it with a particular careful neutrality that was doing a lot of work. Emma kept her face steady. I had coffee with someone. Someone who came through administration this morning and requested access to restricted patient information. He had appropriate federal credentials. His access was granted through proper channels, which I documented. You documented. Phelps repeated it with the inflection of someone storing it for later. Vasquez, the ICU patient in room 4, has apparently become something of a, he gestured vaguely, situation. Administration is tracking it closely. Dr. Okafor is leading the medical team. I'd like to be clear that the nursing involvement should be appropriate to the nursing role. Emma looked at him. My nursing involvement has been providing care to a patient in my unit. That's the role. You were float coverage for 1 shift. I was, and now I'm off that unit. Is there a concern about my documentation or my clinical decisions? He held her gaze and she saw the calculation moving behind his eyes. How much he knew, how much he didn't, what leverage he had, what this situation was worth to him. Phelps had a particular quality Emma had mapped over her time at Haller Creek. He was adept at positioning himself in proximity to important things. When the outcome was good, he'd been involved. When it wasn't, he'd been appropriately concerned from a distance. Just be aware, Phelps said, that this case has administrative attention. Anything outside standard procedure should be run up the chain. Understood, she said. She went and got her file and left. In the elevator, she looked at her own hands and noticed they were entirely steady, which she took as a decent sign. She came back for her shift at 7 and found the ICU changed in the specific way that institutions changed when something had started to move from routine to significant. There were 2 additional staff at the nursing station. The corridor outside room 4 had been reconfigured slightly. A chair had appeared, placed with intention, and she clocked the angle of it and understood immediately that it was a security position, placed where someone sitting there could see both the room and the hall entrance. Dolan was in the chair. He stood when he saw her. How was your afternoon? He asked. Productive. She looked past him at the room. Any changes? His eyes opened for about 40 seconds at 1600. He didn't track, but they opened. Emma's assessment of the situation updated itself in a rapid, quiet way that she kept off her face. 40 seconds of spontaneous eye-opening in a patient at this stage, this far post-injury, was meaningful. More than meaningful. Was the team notified? Okafor's team came and went. They adjusted his monitoring protocol. Okay. She was already running through the implications clinically, setting them in order. I'll review his chart. There's something else. Dolan said it in the specific tone she was beginning to identify as his version of bracing for impact. Controlled, steady, slightly more still than usual. Ames is coming back. Not this evening. Tomorrow. And he's not coming alone. Emma looked at him directly. What does that mean? It means things are moving faster than anticipated. He paused. The situation that put Marcus in that bed. He stopped. She noticed he'd used the name, and from his expression, he'd noticed it too. The situation. It's resolved, which means certain things that couldn't happen while it was active can now happen. Emma absorbed that. She'd learned in 2 deployments that resolved situations had a specific aftermath. Paperwork, acknowledgments, the formal closing of loops that had been left open because the operational tempo didn't allow for closing them. What kinds of things? Dolan looked at her with that same quality of careful assessment. The kind that are going to get complicated for you, in terms of your position here. How complicated? I don't know yet. I want to be straight with you about that. He said it plainly, the way she'd come to expect from him. Not hedging, not softening. Ames is bringing someone with command authority. There's going to be a formal presence here starting tomorrow. And when the administration of this hospital understands what they've had in that room for the past 4 days, things are going to shift. They're going to want to be visible, Emma said. Yes. And the people who've been managing the case, or managing it in theory, from a distance, they're going to want credit for whatever the outcome is. Dolan's expression confirmed it without a word. Emma had seen this before too, in a completely different context. The way that good outcomes attracted people who hadn't been anywhere near them while the outcome was uncertain. She'd watched it happen in the field, in a different way. The briefings that included names of people who'd been in the rear, the commendations that read differently from what she'd witnessed firsthand. It wasn't a civilian-only phenomenon. It was just a people phenomenon. My role in this is my role, she said. I'm his nurse while I'm on this unit. That's all I need it to be. I know, Dolan said. I just wanted you to see it coming. She appreciated that. She didn't say so, because he'd know without her saying. She went inside and began her shift. 2 hours in, Deborah Wills arrived again, this time on schedule, legitimately on shift, with the particular energy of someone who'd spent a day gathering information and was ready to use it. She went directly to the station and stood until Emma looked up. I reviewed your documentation from last night, Deborah said. And? It's complete. Yes. I also spoke with Dr. Phelps. She let that land. He's concerned about the dynamic developing around the patient in room 4, the level of military presence, the involvement of outside parties in what should be a standard medical situation. Emma set her pen down. She gave Deborah her full attention, which she'd learned was the thing Deborah actually wanted, and the thing that also made Deborah slightly uncomfortable, because being given full attention meant being expected to actually say something. If Dr. Phelps has clinical concerns, he can bring them to Dr. Okafor, Emma said. The medical management is Dr. Okafor's decision. I'm not talking about clinical concerns, I'm talking about the overall handling. Deborah's word choice was doing something Emma recognized, circling without landing, establishing territory without defining it. The visitors you cleared, the phone calls you're apparently taking from military liaisons. I'm not taking phone calls from anyone during my shifts. Before your shift. My private time is my private time, Deborah. When it affects this unit, it's not private. Emma looked at her. She thought about 6 years of this. Not just Deborah, but the pattern Deborah represented. The particular way that people in mid-level institutional authority managed perceived threats. Not through confrontation, through process. Through the suggestion that something might be improper. Through the implication of concern, through the friction of oversight that didn't quite have a specific object. What do you want? Emma said, directly, not rudely, but without softening. Deborah blinked. I want this case handled professionally. It is being handled professionally. I want to be included in any decisions that affect this unit. Any clinical decisions affecting this unit go through Dr. Okafor and the relevant charge nurse, which is you during your shift hours. I haven't circumvented that. The visitor approvals were approved by the overnight administrative coordinator and are fully documented. Emma picked up her pen again. Is there anything else? There was a long pause. Deborah's face went through something that wasn't quite embarrassment and wasn't quite anger. Something between them, the feeling of reaching for leverage and finding your hand closing around air. Just keep me informed, she said finally. Of anything clinically relevant, absolutely, Emma said. Deborah left. Emma went back to her documentation. She noticed distantly that the back of her neck had the tight feeling it got when a situation was compressing from multiple sides simultaneously, and she rolled her shoulders once, quietly, in the way she'd learned to do when her body needed acknowledgement that didn't have time to be indulged. She went in to check on him at 10. He was the same, still, monitored, the steady green lines of his vitals crossing the screen with the calm of a body doing the work of recovery. She adjusted a drip. She checked the drain. She stood at the bedside and looked at his face. Your name came out today, she said quietly. Not to me officially, but I know. She paused. Marcus. She watched his face. Nothing. She hadn't expected anything. You've got a lot of people in a lot of trouble on your behalf, which apparently is not new for you. She checked the pressure reading. I've been where you're going, kind of. The coming back part. The figuring out what matters. She straightened the blanket. It's not clean, just so you know. Coming back is not clean, but it's worth it. She said the last part and then felt slightly ridiculous about it, in the good way, the way that meant you'd done something real. She went back to her station. At 11:40, Priya, the day shift nurse she liked, who was covering a late extension tonight, came to the station with a look on her face that Emma read immediately as something having shifted. He's talking, Priya said. Emma was up and moving before the sentence was finished. Room 4. She pushed the door and stepped in, and Dolan was already standing, pressed against the wall to give space, and the man in the bed, Marcus, had his head turned at a slight angle and his eyes were open, not the spontaneous opening of earlier, not unfocused and reflexive. He was looking at the ceiling. His lips were moving. Emma went to the bedside and leaned in. She kept her voice low and level. Hey, I'm Emma. I've been your nurse. You're at Haller Creek Medical Center. You're safe. He turned his head toward her voice. His eyes found her. Not sharply, not with the clarity that would come later, but they found her. The focus was incomplete, like a lens that hadn't finished adjusting. But it was focus. His lips moved again. She bent closer. What he said wasn't intelligible. It was fragments. Consonants that didn't quite connect, syllables that had been on their way to words for a long time and were still finding their shape. But the intent was there. The direction was there. He was trying. She put her hand over his, the same way she had at 5 in the morning. You don't have to say anything yet. You don't have to do anything. You're back. That's enough. He exhaled. It was a long, rough exhale, the kind that cleared a lot of things. Then, quietly, imperfectly, with the quality of someone saying something they'd been holding for a very long time without being sure they'd ever get to say it. Didn't think. He stopped, his eyes closed. But his hand, under hers, was holding on. She looked at Dolan across the bed. His face, for the first time since she'd met him, was not controlled. It was just a face, a person's face, with everything in it that a person would have when the worst thing they'd been afraid of had reversed itself in real time right in front of them. Emma squeezed Marcus's hand once and let go. She went to the door to give Dolan the room. She was halfway through the frame when she heard Dolan's voice behind her, rough and quiet and real, saying something to his teammate in a voice that was not for anyone else to hear. She pulled the door closed. She was leaning against the wall in the corridor, documenting on her tablet, when Priya appeared at her elbow and said, "Administration just called down. Apparently there are 3 black SUVs in the parking lot, and no one knows who authorized them." Emma kept writing. "They'll be here for the patient in room 4. Who are they?" Emma looked up from the tablet. Down the corridor, she could see the elevator numbers changing. Ground floor, rising, someone coming up. "People who've been waiting a long time," she said. The elevator doors opened. The man who walked out was in uniform, Not the civilian approximation of it, not the careful plainclothes version she'd seen from Dolan and his team. Full dress, brass, the rank insignia of a command-level officer. Behind him, two more in uniform. Behind them, in civilian clothes, a woman Emma didn't recognize with a hard drive case in one hand and a look on her face that was entirely focused and entirely purposeful. The command officer stopped when he reached Emma. He looked at her, at the tablet, at the name badge that said Vasquez E. RN. Nurse Vasquez, he said. Yes, sir. He looked down the corridor toward room 4 and then back at her, and his expression did something complicated that she had about 3 seconds to read before it went back to command neutral. I'm Brigadier General Harlan Stride, he said. USS OCOM. I've been briefed on the care you've provided. He paused. I'm going to need you to walk me through everything that happened since he arrived. Emma looked at him. She looked at the two officers behind him, and the woman with the hard drive, and the hallway that had been quiet 10 minutes ago and was quiet no longer. I can do that, she said. Good. He started toward the room and then stopped and turned back. There was something in his face now that she hadn't expected. Something that wasn't command business, wasn't briefing protocol. Dolan told me what you said, about consciousness and voice. He held her gaze for a moment. I need you to understand that what's about to happen in this hospital is going to change your situation here in ways you haven't anticipated. Emma held his gaze back. In what way? Stride looked at her steadily. The administration of this facility is about to learn exactly who they have on their nursing staff. A pause that was not quite long enough for her to respond to. And who they've had for 6 years. Down the hall, the door to room 4 opened, and Dolan leaned out, and the expression on his face said that whatever was happening inside had shifted again. Sir, Dolan said, he's asking for someone. Stride looked at him. For who? Dolan looked at Emma. He said the nurse, Dolan said. He said the one who talks. Emma walked down the hall, not fast, not slow. The same pace she used when moving through a situation that required her to look like she knew exactly where she was going, even when the ground had shifted under her feet, which it had, several times in the last 5 minutes alone. Stride fell into step beside her without being invited, which told her something about how he operated. Dolan had gone back inside the room. The two officers in his wake held position near the elevator with the trained patience of people who'd spent a lot of time waiting in corridors. She pushed the door open. The room was the same room it had always been. Same monitors, same green lines, same controlled light. But the quality of it had changed, the way rooms changed when the thing you'd been waiting for finally arrived. Marcus's eyes were open. Not the unfocused half-open of earlier. Open. Tracking, finding faces and holding them in a way that was effortful and incomplete, but unmistakably intentional. He found Emma's face. His mouth worked for a second before the words came out, and when they did, they were rough and slow, like language was something he was reconstructing from parts. You talked, the whole time. I did, she said. She came to his bedside and checked his pressure reading without making it look like that was what she was doing. How are you feeling? He considered the question with the particular seriousness of someone for whom honesty was not optional. Like I got hit by a building. Close enough, she said. Does anything feel wrong? Sharp pain, numbness, anything you can't account for? He shifted slightly against the pillow, and his face did the thing faces did when movement confirmed what the brain hadn't yet fully processed. Everything hurts approximately equally, nothing specific. That's actually good information. She looked at his pupils. Equal, reactive, not what she'd have expected 3 days ago. She noted it. You've been unconscious for close to 5 days. He closed his eyes for a moment, opened them again. I know. How? A pause. I don't know exactly. I just know. He turned his head slightly and found Stride. Something moved across his face, not surprise, more like the feeling of understanding what this meant. Sir? Rest, Stride said. That's an order. Sir, the situation is handled. Stride said it with a finality that was not a comfort. It was a door closing. All of it. Don't. Marcus absorbed this. His eyes went back to Emma. You were Army. Yes. Medic. Yes. I could tell. He said it simply, like he was observing a fact about weather. The way you touch things. You have economy. His eyes were getting heavier again. Not unconscious, just the body insisting on its terms. Most people who come in here, they're performing, checking things to show they checked things. You were checking things because the things mattered. Emma said nothing. She adjusted his drip and made a notation. Thank you, he said. You don't have to thank me. I want to. His voice was fading at the edges. It mattered, knowing someone was there. She looked at him for a moment, at the ruined sleep in his face, at the hand with the paracord bracelet resting on the blanket, at the whole accumulated weight of what he'd apparently been and done distilled into this. A man in a hospital bed saying thank you in the voice of someone who hadn't expected to be able to say anything again. Rest, she said. We'll talk more when you've got more. He was asleep before she reached the door. What? Stride was waiting in the corridor. He had the look of a man assembling a conversation while another one was still finishing. How long before he's coherent enough for debrief, he said. Medically? 2 to 4 days before sustained lucidity. After that, physical recovery is going to be the variable. She kept her voice clinical, not because she didn't have feelings about the question, but because the clinical version was the useful one right now. His brain took significant trauma. The verbal response you just saw is ahead of where we expected him to be, which is good. But pushing him before he's ready is going to set him back. And setback is measured in weeks, not days. Stride looked at the closed door. He's been in situations where a debrief timeline of 2 to 4 days was operationally catastrophic. He's not in that situation now, Emma said. He's in a hospital. Stride looked at her. He had the expression of a man who was used to variables cooperating with his timeline and had enough experience to know when they weren't going to. Understood. He walked to the window at the end of the corridor. Emma followed, because his posture said the conversation wasn't finished. Outside, the parking lot was visible, and she could see the 3 black SUVs sitting with their running lights off, patient in the dark. There's going to be a formal presence here starting tomorrow morning, Stride said. I tried to keep it smaller, but the command decision moved above my pay grade. He said the last part with the dry delivery of someone who had made the observation before and found it tiresome. Congressional oversight has been notified. There's going to be a liaison from the Senate Armed Services Committee. Everything that happened, the operation, the injury, the recovery, it goes on record. That's not my area, Emma said. No, but some of what goes on that record is. He turned from the window. Your care of him. The decisions you made during the first night, the visitor management, all of it. He paused. I want you to know, before tomorrow, that what you did is going to be on record as precisely what it was. I will see to that personally. She understood what he was telling her, and she understood what he wasn't telling her, which was that it was going to get complicated before it got recorded, and that the complications were going to have specific faces attached to them. What time tomorrow? She said. 7 a.m. I'm on nights. I know. I'm telling you anyway. He looked at her steadily. Because you're going to want to be prepared for the institutional response when the administration of this hospital understands the full scope. She thought about Phelps in the corridor, about Deborah's face during the documentation review, about 6 years of quiet and adequate, and the way institutional systems rewarded the appearance of competence far more reliably than its actual presence. I've been prepared for institutional responses for a long time, she said. Stride almost smiled. It didn't quite make it, but the intention was there. I believe you. He went to brief his team. Emma went back to her station and kept working, because the patients who weren't Marcus still had needs that didn't pause for significant moments, and the IV in Bay 2 was running low, and someone had failed to restock the medication cart before handoff, and the world was made of small things that kept going regardless. By midnight, the hospital had a specific kind of tension running through it, the kind that moved floor to floor through the staff network, which was faster and more accurate than any administrative memo. People knew there were military people on the 4th floor. People knew the unidentified patient had apparently identified. The rumor that was making its rounds by 12:30 was that he was government, which was vague enough to mean anything and specific enough to mean everything to the particular people who mattered. Deborah heard it at 12:45. Emma knew because she watched Deborah's posture change when she came back from a break with a slightly different quality of attention than she'd had going in. She didn't confront Emma about it directly this time. She went to the nursing station and began pulling documentation, and the particular way she was pulling it, cross-referencing dates, looking at visitor logs, checking administrative approvals, told Emma exactly what she was building. A record. Not of what had gone wrong, of what she hadn't been included in. Which was, for Deborah, functionally the same thing. Emma watched this for 40 minutes and then made a decision. She went to the station. She stood next to Deborah and said, quietly so no one else could hear, "Whatever you're building, I'd encourage you to think carefully about the context you're building it in." Deborah looked up sharply. "Excuse me? There are going to be people in this hospital tomorrow with a complete picture of the last 5 days. What you were doing during those days, where you were, what decisions you made or didn't make, that's going to be visible." Emma kept her voice level. This wasn't a threat. It was information. "I'm not your enemy. I've never been your enemy. But I'm also not going to let a documentation effort that misrepresents what happened go uncontested." The silence between them was very specific, the kind that had edges. "Are you threatening me?" Deborah said. "No. I'm telling you the truth, which is something I do regardless of whether it's convenient." Emma paused. "You've been doing this job for 17 years, and you're good at parts of it. That's real. But this situation has moved outside what either of us controls, and the most useful thing you could do right now is let it." Deborah looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across her face that Emma hadn't seen there before. Not exactly self-awareness, but something adjacent to it. The beginning of a calculation that wasn't about leverage. She went back to her documentation. She didn't pull the additional cross-references. Emma went back to work. At 2:15 in the morning, Marcus woke up again. This time with more behind his eyes. He was sitting up slightly when Emma came in, or attempting to, which the ICU bed wasn't fully cooperating with. She raised the head 12 degrees without commentary, which seemed to satisfy whatever he was negotiating with gravity. "You were at Kunar," he said. She stopped. "How did you—" "Ames. He mentioned it while I was coming in and out earlier. I was conscious for more of yesterday than people realize." He looked at her steadily. His focus was sharper than it had been 3 hours ago, which was both good clinically and meant she was talking to someone who was going to ask real questions. "Second rotation. What base?" I'm not asking for records. I'm asking if we were in the same place at the same time." He paused. "Because there was a medic outside Asadabad. There was a contact and a vehicle extraction, and a medic who did a thoracic needle decompression in the back of a moving LMTV on a guy whose lung was 90% collapsed." His eyes were on her face. "I heard about it secondhand. I never got a name." Emma was very still. She remembered the LMTV. She remembered the noise, the road, the radio, the sound of a man breathing wrong. She remembered the needle, which she'd improvised from what she had, which was not what she would have chosen in a different environment, and the horrible, useful sensation of the pressure releasing. "He lived," she said. Marcus's expression did something that didn't have a clean name. "He did. He's still active." A pause. "His name's Kowalczyk. He talks about that day every time someone tells him field medicine is mostly theoretical." Emma said nothing for a moment. She looked at the monitors. She looked at the man in the bed who, it turned out, had a thread of connection to a single afternoon years ago that she'd filed in the part of herself she didn't access during regular shifts. "Small world," she said finally. "Smaller than it should be," he said. And then, "Why'd you leave?" "The army." "Yes." She sat in the chair, not because this was going to be a long conversation. He needed to rest, but because the question deserved sitting. "My last rotation ended and I looked at what another one would cost. Not me. The people around me. My mother was sick. There were things I needed to be present for that I couldn't be present for from overseas." She paused. "It wasn't dramatic. It was just math." He looked at her. "Do you miss it?" She considered the honest answer again, which was becoming a habit around him. "I miss the clarity," she said. "Civilian medicine has a lot of noise that combat medicine doesn't. In the field, you know exactly what matters. And here you spend a lot of time managing systems that have no clear relationship to patient outcomes." She shifted. "But I don't miss the cost of the clarity." So, he repeated. "How's your pain?" "Manageable." which she translated as significant. "You don't have to stay." "I know I don't." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said something that surprised her by being simple. "I'm glad you talked. Those days, I was aware of more than I could respond to, and it helped to have a voice that wasn't about the situation, that was just regular. I talked about vending machine crackers at one point. I know, it was the best part." She almost laughed. Something close to it, anyway. She checked his chart, made her notations, stood. "Sleep," she said, "working on it." But 7 a.m. arrived with the particular quality of institutional bracing. Emma was still on the floor. She'd extended because the day shift had come in short, and there was no one else to cover the 4-bed load, which was a fact she'd put in her log with precise timestamps because she was not operating in an environment where imprecision was her friend. The elevator opened at 7:04, and Stride came out with 2 people she hadn't seen yet. One was in uniform, a woman with the insignia of a senior naval officer that Emma placed as a captain. The other was in a gray blazer and carried a soft-sided briefcase, and had the manner of someone who translated between worlds for a living. Behind them came a man Emma had not expected. Dr. Garrison Phelps, in his good jacket, walking with the specific proprietary stride of someone who had decided this moment belonged to him. She watched him position himself just behind Stride's left shoulder, at the angle of someone who wanted to be visible without being obviously present. It was practiced. He'd done this before. Stride came to the station. "Nurse Vasquez, good, you're still here." "Short-staffed," she said. I stayed on. "I need 5 minutes. The briefing is at 7:30 in the conference room on 6. "I'm not in the briefing." "You are. I added you." He said it without checking whether that was acceptable, which was not Stride being dismissive. It was Stride operating on the assumption that this had already been established. It hadn't been. But she looked at his face and understood that arguing the point would cost more than attending. "Fine," she said. Phelps stepped forward. He extended his hand to Stride with the fluid confidence of someone who expected to be greeted. "Dr. Garrison Phelps, Head of Emergency Services. I've been closely involved with the management of this case since admission." Stride looked at the hand. He shook it. His expression was entirely polite and entirely opaque. "Thank you for the support your facility has provided." "Of course. Anytime we can partner with, I appreciate it." Stride had already turned back to Emma. 7:30, 6th floor. Phelps was left with the specific expression of someone whose hand had been shaken and then walked away from, and who didn't yet understand why. What? The conference room on 6 was the hospital's formal boardroom, the one reserved for donor presentations and senior administrative meetings. Emma had been in it twice in 6 years. She sat at the far end of the table from the head, where Stride and the naval captain had taken position, with the Senate liaison beside them, and a digital display that was currently showing a seal she recognized, and 3 lines of text that she immediately stopped reading because it wasn't her information. The hospital's senior administration had arrived. The CEO, a small woman named Judith Farrar, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the compressed energy of someone who'd built something through specific force of will. The COO, the medical director. Phelps sat adjacent to the medical director with his notepad out. Deborah was not there. She wasn't senior enough for this table. Farrar looked at Emma with the specific attention of a person encountering someone in an unexpected context and recalibrating. Emma had met Farrar exactly once, in a hallway, when Farrar had been walking fast to something else. Farrar had not paused. Stride opened the meeting efficiently. He did not talk like a man who wasted time in rooms. He covered the basics: patient status, identity, still not fully named in open session, but framed clearly enough. The operational context at the level the civilian personnel in the room were cleared to know. He used precise language and no drama. Then he turned to what had happened during the admission and recovery period. The care this patient received from the time of his arrival was, he paused. I want to use the right word here. Extraordinary would suggest it was above and beyond what a reasonable practitioner might provide. That's not quite accurate. What's accurate is that the care was exactly what this patient needed, and that the practitioner who provided it had the knowledge and training to recognize what was needed and execute on it without institutional support, instruction, or credit. He looked at Emma. The nurse who managed his case during the critical overnight period was Nurse Emma Vasquez. The room turned toward her. She kept her face still. Nurse Vasquez is a former Army combat medic, Stride continued. 2 overseas rotations, including a deployment that intersected with theaters of operation relevant to this patient's background. The specific clinical decisions she made during the first night, particularly the identification of a prior surgical intervention that contradicted the initial intake assessment, may have prevented a second operation that the surgical team was leaning toward. He paused. She also provided continuous patient monitoring and direct communication that contributed meaningfully to the patient's neurological recovery. Farrar was looking at Emma with an expression that had moved through several stages in the last 60 seconds. She reached out and took her glasses off the chain and put them on and looked at Emma again, as if looking more carefully would explain the gap between the person she was seeing and the person she'd apparently been classifying. Phelps had stopped writing. The medical director was looking at Phelps, and then at the table, and then at Stride, with the expression of someone doing mathematics about the discrepancy between what they were hearing and what had been represented to them previously. "I was unaware," Farrar said finally, "of Nurse Vasquez's background." "That's one of the things I'd like to discuss," Stride said. The meeting ran 45 minutes. Emma said very little because it wasn't a meeting that required much from her. It required things from the people in the room who hadn't been doing what they should have been doing for 6 years, while someone with considerable capability worked under flickering lights in Bay 7 and filed maintenance requests into the void. She watched Phelps across the table. He had started the meeting with his notepad in his adjacency posture. By the 20-minute mark, the notepad was closed. By 30 minutes, he had the specific stillness of a man who understood that the room had become, quietly and definitively, a room he did not control. Farrar, Emma was discovering, was sharp. She asked the right questions in the right order, not performing comprehension, actually building it. She looked at Stride and she looked at Emma, and she looked at the documentation Stride's liaison had quietly placed in front of her, and her reading glasses moved quickly across the pages. At the 40-minute mark, she asked a question that neither Stride nor Emma had prompted. "What is the current supervisory relationship between Nurse Vasquez and the charge nursing structure on her unit?" Phelps answered before anyone else could. "Standard. She reports to the charge nurse for her shift, who reports to the nursing director." "And who is the nursing director?" A pause. "Barbara Wills oversees nights. Deborah Wills is charge nurse." Farrar looked at her COO. A specific look. The COO wrote something. "I'd like a comprehensive review of Nurse Vasquez's employment record," Farrar said. "Specifically, any performance flags, any incident reports, any documentation of clinical recommendations that were rejected or delayed." She took her glasses off. "I'd like it before end of business today." Phelps opened his mouth. "Dr. Phelps," Farrar said. Her voice was precise and entirely without temperature. "Thank you for your time." He understood the dismissal. He closed his mouth. He picked up his notepad. He stood and left the room with the walk of a man who had entered at one elevation and was leaving at another and was doing his best not to show it. Emma watched him go. She got back to the floor at 8:50. Marcus was awake again, more wakeful than the previous times, pushing towards something like sustained consciousness, which was both good and was going to make the next few days considerably more demanding for everyone, including him. Dolan was in the corridor. He fell into step beside her without ceremony. "How was 6? "Informative." "For who?" "Everyone, eventually." He almost smiled. Stride briefed the board. "Farrar is sharper than her hospital might suggest." "Administrators usually are," Dolan said. "The ones who last." He paused. "Marcus wants to sit up properly. The nursing team told him he needed clearance." "He does need clearance. I'll talk to Okafor." "He's not good at waiting." "Nobody's good at waiting. That's not a special quality." She stopped outside the room. "I know you're running a timeline here. I know there are things that need to happen that are above my pay grade. But his brain needs time, and time is the one thing I can't manufacture." Dolan looked at her directly. "I know. I'm not pushing. You're adjacent to pushing." He paused. "Fair." A beat. "He asked about you while you were in the meeting, asked where the nurse was." Emma looked at the door. "Specific question." "He's a specific person." She went inside. He was sitting up as far as the bed would allow, which wasn't far, and he had the look of someone who'd been applying his assessment faculties to the room and had cataloged everything in it. She'd seen this before. The hypervigilance that didn't turn off even in recovery, the trained mind continuing to process even when the body was not cooperating. "The meeting on 6, he said. "You know about it." "Dolan told me." He shifted, and she saw the careful way he did it, managing pain without signaling it more than once. "What happened?" Stride briefed the administration on your care history, the details relevant to their situation. "And yours." "And mine." She checked the monitor, checked the drain, gave herself something to do with her hands that wasn't just standing there being looked at. "Your CEO is going to do an employment review." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good outcome." "It's an outcome. Whether it's good depends on what they find and what they do with it." "What do you think they'll find?" She paused. This was the question she'd been not quite asking herself for 24 hours. 6 years of someone being placed where she was useful without ever being asked if she was capable of something more. Which is common. It's not a dramatic injustice. It's just, she reached for the word, inertia. "Inertia kills people," Marcus said. "I've seen it happen in contexts where the cost was clearer. It kills people slowly in hospital systems too." She met his eyes. "The protocol I flagged 18 months ago, that Deborah shelved without bringing to the medical team, there were 3 cases in the following 6 months where that protocol might have changed the outcome. I can't prove causation, but I know what I observed." He was very still. "Write it down." "I have. Everything." "All of it?" "Every incident, every date, every recommendation I made, and every time it was dismissed or ignored." She'd been keeping the file since year 2. Not out of paranoia, out of the basic principle she'd learned in the field, which was that documentation was the only thing that survived when everything else was subject to interpretation. "I have a complete record." Marcus looked at her with an expression that held something she couldn't easily name. Not admiration exactly, something more practical than that. The look of someone recognizing a methodology they understood. "Good," he said. The morning moved. Okafor cleared Marcus for adjusted positioning, which improved his alertness and his mood simultaneously. The naval captain, her name was Reyes, Emma eventually learned, spent 40 minutes in the room reviewing classified materials that Emma carefully didn't look at. The Senate liaison set up a temporary workspace in the family consultation room down the hall with the serene efficiency of someone who operated in chaos the way Emma operated in ICUs. At 11:15, Farrar appeared on the 4th floor. Not with her COO, not with a team. Alone, which was either confidence or the specific kind of administrative reconnaissance that preceded larger decisions. She found Emma at the nursing station. "Nurse Vasquez." She sat in the visitor chair without asking, which Emma noted. "I'm going to be direct with you." "Please." "I've read your employment file." She paused. "I pulled it personally this morning before the review team completed their work. I wanted to form my own picture." She took her glasses off the chain and held them rather than putting them on. "In 6 years, you have 3 formal commendations from attending physicians. You have no incident reports as a subject. You have 2 incident reports as a witness, both of which document you raising concerns that were subsequently ignored. You have 7 maintenance requests from Bay 7 alone that were never actioned." 8, Emma said. "The last one was filed 2 weeks ago." Farrar absorbed this. "You've also never applied for a position above staff nurse." "I wasn't aware there were positions worth applying for." "There are. There weren't adequately communicated to you." A pause. "That's a failure of this institution, not of your judgment." Emma said nothing. "I want to ask you something," Farrar said. "Not administratively, personally." She looked at Emma steadily. "Why did you stay?" "Not the answer you give in professional contexts. The real one." Emma thought about the vending machine crackers and the 4 a.m. silence and the feeling of a hand responding under hers. She thought about what she'd told Ames, that enough was a moving target. She thought about Darren, who was apparently still alive and still talking about a specific afternoon. "Because patients kept coming," she said, "and I was good at what they needed." She paused. "The institution was imperfect. The work wasn't." Farrar looked at her for a long moment. She put her glasses back on the chain. "The review will be complete by end of week," she said. "I'd like to meet again after that, if you're willing." I'm willing. Farrar stood. She looked down the corridor toward room 4 where Dolan was in his chair and the monitors were running and Marcus was doing the slow, non-optional work of recovery. Then she looked back at Emma. What you did during those first days, she said. It was exceptional. I did my job. I know you did. That's what was exceptional about it. She left the way she'd arrived, alone, direct, purposeful. Emma went back to her documentation. But at 1:30, she was covering the handoff between her extended shift and the afternoon team when Reyes appeared at the station with the specific look of someone carrying information that needed to go somewhere. Nurse Vasquez. Reyes had the clipped, information-dense delivery of someone for whom every sentence was deliberate. Marcus has asked to speak with you privately, 10 minutes. I'll come now if that works. He's expecting you. She went down. She pushed the door. Marcus was alone. Dolan had been sent for coffee, she suspected, with the same efficiency with which everything around this man seemed to get arranged. He was sitting up at 30 degrees and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like someone who'd made a decision and was now implementing it. I want to tell you something, he said. Okay. When the formal parts are done, the review, the testimony, all of it, he paused. There's going to be a ceremony. That's not my choice. It happens in these situations, and I don't have the standing to decline it. He looked at her directly. I want you there. Not as a guest, as someone being recognized. Emma looked at him. I'm a nurse, she said. Yes. And you served, and you kept me alive, and those things don't belong in separate categories. He held her gaze with the steady, deliberate attention of someone who was not making a gesture. Will you be there? She thought about the protocol she'd flagged 18 months ago, about the 7 maintenance requests, about the flickering lights in Bay 7 and the way Deborah's expression had shifted during documentation review and the moment Phelps had closed his notepad. Yes, she said. He nodded. The decision registered and settled. Then his eyes moved to the door and his expression changed. Not dramatically, barely perceptibly. But Emma had been reading subtle shifts in people's faces for a long time, and what she read in his face was alertness, the specific kind. Someone's in the hall, he said. She turned. Through the small window in the door, she could see the corridor and she could see Dolan's chair, which was empty, and she could see 2 people standing near the nursing station, one of whom was Phelps, and the other of whom she didn't recognize. She pushed the door open. Phelps was at the station. The person with him was a man in a suit, mid-40s, carrying a document folder, with the specific body language of someone who'd come to deliver something rather than discuss it. Priya was at the desk, looking at the document the man had placed in front of her with an expression Emma read in 1 second. She crossed the distance. She looked at the document. It was an administrative transfer order. Patient Marcus Doe, room 4. Transferred to the care of a private facility to be determined, effective upon medical clearance, authorized by the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. With a secondary signature Emma had never seen before, from an office she didn't recognize. She looked at Phelps. His face had recovered some of its earlier confidence. He had something to work with again. Vasquez, this doesn't concern the nursing staff. This is an administrative and medical decision. He's not medically cleared for transfer, she said. That determination will be made by the CMO. Dr. Okafor is his attending. Transfer decisions go through the attending physician. Dr. Okafor has been consulted. He said it with the smoothness of someone who'd prepared for this particular objection. This is a routine administrative process. Emma looked at the document again. The secondary signature. The office designation. She looked at Priya, who gave her a microscopic look that said, I don't know who this person is either. When was Dr. Okafor consulted? Emma said. Phelps paused. Half a second, just half. This morning. Before or after the 7:30 meeting? The pause this time was longer. I don't see what the timing... Emma picked up the desk phone. What are you doing? Phelps said. Calling Dr. Okafor. She held his gaze while she dialed. To confirm the consult. The man in the suit had gone still with the particular stillness of someone whose timeline had just become uncertain. Phelps had the look of someone watching a plan engage a complication it hadn't fully accounted for. The call went through. Okafor picked up on the 3rd ring. Dr. Okafor, Emma said, This is Vasquez on 4. I have a transfer order for the patient in room 4 that lists you as consulted. Can you confirm? The silence on the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. I haven't been consulted on any transfer, Okafor said. Stay on the line, Emma said. She set the handset on the desk without putting it down, Okafor's voice still audible, asking what was happening. And she looked at Phelps with the specific quality of attention she'd developed over 2 deployments for situations where she had one correct move and needed to identify it without telegraphing that she was identifying it. Phelps looked at the handset. He understood what it meant. The mathematics of the room had shifted in the span of 4 seconds, and he was recalculating, which was visible in the way his jaw tightened and then released. The man in the suit had gone very still. Dr. Phelps, Emma said, keeping her voice entirely level. The attending physician has not authorized this transfer. That makes this document non-executable under hospital policy, Section 14, which requires attending sign-off for any transfer of a patient classified as high dependency. She paused. I'd like you to tell me who authorized the secondary signature on this form. Phelps looked at the man in the suit, a look that asked for something. The man in the suit gave him nothing back, which told Emma something about how this had been structured and who was load-bearing in it. This is an administrative decision that doesn't require your input, Phelps said. The smoothness had a crack in it now. Not a break, just a line of stress. I'm not offering input. I'm following protocol. She picked up the handset. Dr. Okafor, the transfer order for your patient in room 4 carries a secondary authorization from an office I don't recognize. I'm going to need you to come up and review it before anything moves. I'll be there in 10 minutes, Okafor said, and the line had an edge to it now that said he understood this was not a routine question. Emma hung up. She looked at the man in the suit. While we're waiting, your identification, please. He opened his jacket and produced a card. She took it, read it. She kept her face neutral. The office listed was one she'd need to look up, but the institutional affiliation on it was not a hospital affiliation. It was something further outside than that. She placed the card on the desk. She looked at Phelps. Sir, she said, I'd recommend not going anywhere in the next 10 minutes. Phelps straightened. He had the look of a man who'd been maneuvered somewhere he didn't intend to be and was too committed to the direction to reverse easily. You are overstepping your role significantly, Vasquez. My role is patient safety, she said. I'm exactly in it. She turned and went back to room 4. Marcus had heard enough through the door to have the picture mostly assembled. She could see it in his face when she came in, the alert processing quality that said he'd been listening and was 3 steps ahead of her already. Transfer order, he said. It wasn't a question. Forged attending signature, or rather, a signature that shouldn't be there at all. Who? I don't know yet. The authorization came from outside the hospital. She sat in the chair because standing would have made her look like she was managing something, and he'd already managed the same information calmly. She owed him the same. Okafor is coming up. Stride needs to know. Yes. She picked up her phone. She had Dolan's number. He'd given it to her on the second night, matter-of-factly, in the way people gave numbers when they expected them to be used. She called. He picked up on the first ring. There's a problem on the floor, she said. You need to come up, and Stride needs to know there's been an unauthorized transfer order filed for your patient. A pause. 3 seconds, maybe. Is he secure? Currently, but this needs to move fast. 2 minutes, Dolan said. She ended this call. Marcus was looking at the ceiling with an expression she'd learned to read as him doing something internal that was more like calculation than anything resembling worry. He was the least afraid person she'd encountered in a hospital context, which was simultaneously reassuring and slightly unsettling. You're good at this, he said without looking at her. At what? At managing a situation that has more variables than it should have. He looked at her then. A lot of people in your position would have waited to see how it played out. A lot of people in my position would have handed the document to Priya and gone to document their morning medications. Why didn't you? She thought about it. Honest answer. Because in the field, the moment you see something wrong and decide it's not your problem, it becomes the worst version of your problem 20 minutes later. She paused. Old habit. He almost smiled. Good habit. Well, Dolan arrived in 90 seconds. Not 2 minutes, which meant he'd been closer than the elevator suggested. He was followed 40 seconds later by the naval captain, Reyes, who had the look of someone who'd been briefed in transit and had used the time to form opinions. They went to the nursing station. Emma followed. The man in the suit had not moved. He'd also not spoken again, which was a choice she was filing for later. Phelps was standing with his arms crossed, and the particular posture of someone who'd decided that presence alone constituted a position, which was a miscalculation Emma had watched him make before. Reyes looked at the transfer document. She looked at the authorization. Her expression compressed into something very small and very hard. "Who submitted this?" she said. Not loudly. The opposite of loudly. "Phelps. This is an administrative process that was approved through appropriate channels. I'm asking who submitted it." Reyes looked at the man in the suit. "You." The man in the suit considered his options visibly. "I'm a consultant retained by..." "By whom?" Reyes set the document down. "Specifically, right now." A pause that held everything. "I was retained by an external advisory board associated with several of the hospital's private donors. The transfer was requested to a private care facility that has the resources to..." "To what?" Dolan said. He'd been quiet up to this point, and the single question carried more weight than anything else in the corridor. The man in the suit understood then the geography of the room he was in. He stopped talking. Reyes took out her phone. She stepped 2 feet away and made a call. Emma watched her face during the call and saw nothing, which meant the news was significant. Okafor arrived off the elevator at 9 minutes after Emma's call, which was faster than she'd expected, and said something about how he'd received the situation. He was a tall man, methodical in his movements, who brought a focused gravity to every room he entered. He went directly to the document. He read it without speaking. He looked at Phelps. "My name is on this form," he said. "I didn't put it there." Phelps's posture changed. He'd been standing with his arms crossed, and now his arms came down, not in a gesture of openness, in the involuntary way that bodies responded when the thing they'd been braced against shifted direction. "The CMO's office. I spoke with the CMO 40 minutes ago about a scheduling matter," Okafor said. "This was not mentioned." He looked at the secondary authorization. He looked at Priya. "Where did this come from?" Priya looked at the man in the suit. He came to the desk at about 1:20 and presented it. He said it had been processed through administration. "It was not processed through my department," Okafor said. The silence that followed was the specific kind that formed when the weight of a situation settled onto its actual foundation, which was different from where it had appeared to be standing. Reyes came back from her call. She looked at Phelps and said very quietly, "Dr. Phelps, I'd like you to wait in the conference room on this floor. Someone will come to speak with you shortly." Phelps started to say something. "That's not a request," Reyes said. He left. He walked down the corridor and into the family consultation room that the Senate liaison had been using, and the door closed behind him. The man in the suit was already on his phone, which Dolan observed and did not prevent because there was nothing illegal about the call, and because whatever was being said was going somewhere that would be tracked, and that was actually more useful than stopping it. Emma looked at Okafor. "The patient is stable. He's been awake and responding well since approximately 0200. His neuroindicators are ahead of the projected curve." Okafor nodded. The professional mask settling back into place because the crisis had a direction now. "I'll review him now." They went in. Emma waited in the hall. Dolan came to stand beside her. They didn't say anything for a moment, which was its own form of communication. "That document," Dolan said finally. "If it had gone through..." "It wouldn't have," Emma said, "not with Okafor in the loop. But if you hadn't caught it..." She thought about this honestly. "Priya might have flagged it. She's good." A pause. "But she also might have assumed the process was above her. That's what these things depend on. The assumption that paperwork coming from the right direction has already been checked." She looked down the corridor at the closed consultation room door. "Who is Phelps connected to?" "That's what Reyes is finding out." Dolan's voice was the flat, factual kind that said he already had a theory and was waiting for it to be confirmed. "The donor advisory board the consultant mentioned, there's an interest group that has been trying to access the kind of operational data our patient carries for about 3 years. Not foreign. Domestic. Private sector." He paused. His recovery. The window when he'd be conscious but not yet under formal protective protocol. That was the window they needed. Emma processed this. She thought about the man in the suit's stillness, about the specific timing of the transfer order, 11:15, after the 7:30 meeting, after the formal military presence had been established but before the protective protocols were fully in place. They moved too fast, she said. They miscalculated the staffing situation. They expected a day shift handoff at 7, less continuity, less institutional knowledge of the case. He looked at her. They didn't account for you staying on. She hadn't planned to stay on. She'd stayed because the unit was short. The fuel gauge in her car had been at a quarter tank. Small things. What happens now, she said. Reyes manages the security side. Stride manages the command side. He paused. The Senate liaison is going to have a very busy afternoon. And the hospital? Dolan was quiet for a moment. The hospital is going to have a reckoning, not because of the transfer order specifically. That gets handled at a different level, because of what the transfer order exposed about who was making decisions here and why. Emma leaned against the wall. She was tired in the way that came from too many hours at too high an operational tempo, the body's bill arriving slightly late. She ignored it. Phelps wasn't acting alone on the transfer order, she said. No. He's not smart enough to have initiated it. Dolan gave her a look that was almost approval. The CMO's office is being reviewed. Apparently the authorization that appeared on that form corresponds to a document number from a routine administrative filing that was altered. A pause. Someone with access to the administrative system made that change. How long has that person had access? That's the question. What? The afternoon built. Farrar came back at 2 o'clock, this time with her COO and a woman Emma hadn't seen before, who turned out to be the hospital's legal counsel. They went into the 6th-floor conference room, and they were there for 90 minutes. And when Farrar came out, she had the look of someone who'd walked through something difficult and was on the other side of it, and was now moving with the specific purposefulness of someone who had a list. She found Emma at 3:15. I need your complete documentation, Farrar said. Everything you mentioned, the protocol recommendations, the incident reports as witness, the maintenance requests. Everything. I can have it to you by end of day. I also need to know what you observed regarding Dr. Phelps specifically, not the transfer order, prior interactions, clinical decisions you witnessed or were affected by. Emma had been thinking about this for the last 2 hours. She had the file. She'd been keeping the file since year 2, not because she'd planned to use it, but because documentation was what she did. Every date, every interaction, every recommendation dismissed. I'll put it in writing, Emma said. Thank you. Farrar paused. She looked down the corridor with the expression of someone surveying a situation she hadn't caused and was now responsible for containing. Dr. Phelps has been placed on administrative leave pending the review, effective this afternoon. Emma said nothing. The chief medical officer is also under review. His administrative access has been suspended. She said it with the precision of someone reading from a list in her head that she'd finished making and was now executing. The consultant who presented the transfer order is being interviewed by a federal liaison. We've been asked to preserve all documentation and access logs from the past 2 weeks. The past 6 days, specifically, Emma said. Farrar looked at her. Yes, specifically. She paused. I want to be transparent with you, Vasquez. This institution failed you in a number of measurable ways over a period of years. The review will document that. What happens after the review is going to involve you directly, and I'd like your input on what that looks like. Emma thought about saying something measured, something appropriately professional. She thought about the flickering lights in Bay 7 and the protocol flagged 18 months ago, and the 3 cases in the following 6 months, and the file she'd been keeping since year 2. I'd like to be part of the conversation, she said. Not at the end, after the decisions are made. At the beginning. Farrar held her gaze. That's exactly where I want you. She went back to Marcus at 4 o'clock, during the brief window between Okafor's second assessment and Reyes's next security rotation. He was sitting up at a higher angle than the morning. Okafor had cleared 40 degrees, which was progress. And he had the particular quality of alertness she'd been watching develop through the day. The lens clarifying. Phelps, he said when she walked in. Administrative leave. The CMO? Review. Access suspended. He nodded slowly. He had the look of someone who'd tracked this from a distance and was confirming a map against the territory. The consultant. Federal interview. She sat in the chair. How are you feeling? Better than this morning. He said it in the way he said things. No embellishment, just the fact. My head still does the thing where the right edge of my vision gets soft when I turn too fast. That'll clear. 2 weeks, probably. Okafor said the same. He's right. She folded her hands. She was tired in a way that had settled into her bones and was going to require more than one night of sleep to address, and she'd stop pretending otherwise somewhere around noon. I want to ask you something. Ask. The advisory board, the group that wanted access to whatever you carry, are they… She stopped. She was framing the question for the wrong context. She reframed. Is it over? The threat, specifically. Not the investigation, the active threat. He looked at her for a moment. Reyes thinks so. The window they needed was the admission period. That window is closed. And if they try another approach, they won't. Not directly. His jaw shifted slightly. They'll do what entities like that always do when a direct approach fails. They'll wait and find a different angle. But that's not immediate. And the people who need to manage it are managing it. He paused. You don't have to manage it. I know. She looked at her hands. I'm asking because I want to understand the scope of what's been sitting on this floor for a week and whether the people around me are actually safe. He held her gaze. The people around you are safe. I would tell you if they weren't. She believed him. Not because he was a decorated operator, or because Stride trusted him, or because Dolan's loyalty to him was visible from 50 feet, because she'd been watching his face for 7 days, and she could read it. Okay, she said. Thank you, he said, for catching the transfer order. Thank Priya. She looked at the document long enough for me to see her expression. I'll thank Priya too. A beat. But you're the one who made the call. She didn't argue it. She stood, checked his monitors, checked his drain, did the things she'd been doing for 7 days that had been nursing care and turned out to also be something else. Get some sleep, she said. People keep telling me that. People who are correct keep telling you that. Well, she was on her way out at 5:30, finally, legitimately off, having documented everything twice and transferred her notes to the evening team with a thoroughness that was slightly excessive and completely intentional when Dolan caught her at the elevator. Stride wants to brief you tomorrow, he said. Formal this time, not coffee. Conference room 6-9 a.m. I have the morning free. He's also going to ask you about the ceremony. Timeline, logistics. He paused. Marcus officially cleared for low activity status starting Friday, if recovery continues at current rate. That's faster than projected. He's not a typical case. Emma looked at the elevator numbers. What kind of ceremony? Full honors. Small audience by necessity given the classification situation, but full honors. Dolan paused. You'd receive a formal acknowledgement, on record. She was quiet for a moment. I'm going to need to think about what that means, she said. Take the night. He paused. Vasquez. The people in that room with all the brass and the federal liaisons and the classification documents, none of them were here when it mattered. You were here. He said it without drama. Just the fact of it, placed in the air between them. That's what the acknowledgement is for. She nodded once. She got in the elevator. She was in the parking lot, in the specific flat orange light of late afternoon in November, when her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. Nurse Vasquez. The voice was not anyone she'd spoken to before. Female, mid-range, with the clipped efficiency of someone who made a lot of calls. My name is Sandra Voss. I'm a reporter with the National Medical Standards Review. I understand there's been a significant incident at Holler Creek Medical Center involving a military patient and a nursing staff member with a protected background. Emma stopped walking. I'm not able to comment on patient care, she said carefully. I'm not asking about patient care. I'm asking about an administrative action taken against you on the afternoon of November 12th, a formal notice of supervisory review that was placed in your employee file. Emma went still. I'm sorry, she said. A what? A supervisory review notice, signed by Dr. Garrison Phelps, filed at 2:47 p.m. today. A pause. Approximately 40 minutes after he was placed on administrative leave. A beat of silence that had weight in it. Did you know? Emma looked at the orange sky. She looked at her car, 30 feet away. She thought about the file she'd been keeping since year 2. "No," she said. "I didn't know." "Nurse Vasquez," Voss said, "I think you should know that the document is currently visible in the hospital's employee review system, time-stamped, 40 minutes after his suspension, which would make it retaliatory," Emma said. "That was going to be my word," Voss said. "Yes." Emma stood in the parking lot for a moment after the call ended, phone still in her hand, the November air doing what November air did. Cold and indifferent, and absolutely without opinion about what had just happened. Phelps had filed a supervisory review notice against her at 2:47 p.m., 40 minutes after his own suspension, which meant he'd known the suspension was coming, or had been told it was coming, and had used the administrative access he still had in that window to reach backward and put something in her file. A preemptive strike dressed as process. The specific kind of move that required familiarity with institutional systems and absolutely no concern for whether it was right. She looked at the hospital building, 11 stories of brick and glass and fluorescent light, and somewhere in its employee database there was now a document with her name on it that hadn't existed 2 hours ago. She called Farrar. It went to voicemail. She called the COO, whose number she had from the morning's events. He picked up. "Vasquez. The supervisory review notice in my file, filed at 14:47 today. Are you aware of it?" A pause, the kind that confirmed awareness. "We became aware of it approximately 20 minutes ago. Legal is reviewing it. It was filed after his suspension." "I know." "His administrative access should have been revoked at suspension." "It should have." Another pause, harder this time. "There was a delay in the system update. That's being investigated as well." His voice had the tight quality of someone managing several compounding problems simultaneously. "Nurse Vasquez, I want to be clear. This document will not stand. It will be removed from your file, and the filing itself will be part of the formal misconduct record against Dr. Phelps." "I need that in writing," Emma said. "You'll have it tonight. And I need the timestamp preserved. The 2:47 filing time needs to be part of the record, not just the removal, the fact of when it was filed relative to the suspension." A brief silence. "Understood. We'll preserve it." She hung up. She stood for another 3 seconds, doing nothing except letting the cold air be the cold air, and then she got in her car and drove home. She slept 8 hours, not because the situation had resolved, but because her body made the decision for her somewhere around 7 p.m. and she stopped arguing with it. She woke at 3 in the morning with the particular clarity that sometimes came after genuine sleep, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table with her documentation file open in front of her. She went through it systematically, not with anger, with the focused attention she brought to patient assessments, looking for what was actually there rather than what she expected to find. The file was organized by date. She'd been meticulous about it in a way that had felt slightly paranoid at the time, and now felt like the only sensible thing she'd done consistently over 6 years. 18 months of protocol recommendations, each one logged with date, the name of the person she'd given it to, and the response received or not received. 7 maintenance requests for Bay 7, each with the ticket number and the date it had been opened and the date, blank, when it had been closed. 5 incidents as witness, each described in clinical language, each noting who else was present, what the clinical decision had been, and what outcome she'd observed. She added the transfer order. She added the supervisory review notice with its timestamp. She added the COO's verbal confirmation and the request she'd made for written record. By 4:30, she had everything compiled into a single document, organized chronologically, annotated, cross-referenced. She emailed it to herself and saved a copy on 2 separate drives, and then, because she was being thorough, printed a physical copy and put it in the bag she'd take to the 9 o'clock meeting. She made more coffee. She watched the street turn from black to gray to the pale flat light that passed for dawn in November. She wasn't angry. That was the thing she noticed most. She'd been angry before. In the second year, when the first protocol recommendation had been shelved without discussion, she'd driven home angry enough to feel it in her hands. In the 4th year, when a patient outcome had been different than it might have been, she'd sat in her car in this same parking lot and been angry in a way she couldn't do anything useful with. Now she was clear. There was a difference. Anger was weather. Clarity was a tool. The 9 o'clock meeting was in conference room 6 again, which had apparently become the designated space for things that mattered this week. Stride was there. Reyes, the Senate liaison, whose name Emma had learned was Alderman. Farrar, with her COO and the legal counsel, Okafor. Dolan was at the back of the room, not seated at the table. That was his position, at the edge, present, watching. Emma had come to understand this was simply how he operated. She was given a seat at the table, between Okafor and an empty chair, and the empty chair mattered because it signaled the expectation that she belonged in this configuration. Stride ran the meeting. He covered the transfer order investigation first. The consultant had been interviewed the previous evening and had provided information that Alderman described as sufficient for federal referral, which was the specific way people said a great deal without saying it. The advisory board that had retained the consultant had been identified. It was a private equity entity with significant healthcare holdings and a documented interest in certain classified operational data that had been under congressional review for 18 months. The transfer, Stride said, would have moved the patient to a facility where the security posture was not adequate and where certain parties would have had access they did not have here. The attempt failed. The federal investigation is active, and we've been asked not to discuss specifics beyond this room. Alderman nodded once, confirming. On the matter of the institutional issues, Farrar said, taking the table without pause. She had the quality Emma had come to appreciate in her. She didn't perform transition, she just moved. The employment review I initiated yesterday has been completed. I'd like to share the findings. She placed a document in front of Emma without ceremony. Emma looked at it. The findings were clear and they were damning. 6 years of Emma's employment at Holler Creek mapped against institutional decisions. The 18 months of protocol recommendations that had been directed to Deborah and had gone nowhere. The 5 incident reports as witness that had not triggered formal review. The 2 commendations from attending physicians that had never been reflected in advancement opportunities. And the supervisory review notice filed by Phelps at 2:47 p.m. the previous afternoon, time-stamped 40 minutes after his suspension, which the legal team had classified as retaliatory conduct under 3 separate hospital policy provisions. Dr. Phelps's administrative leave has been converted to termination proceedings, Farrar said. Effective as of this morning, the specific grounds are the retaliatory filing, his facilitation of the unauthorized transfer order, and a pattern of performance misrepresentation that the review has documented going back 4 years. She paused. He will not be returning to this facility. Emma kept her face still. She noted distantly that she didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. Not satisfaction exactly, not vindication. Something more like the feeling of a room being finally leveled after years of working on a tilted floor. The relief not of winning, but of having the thing acknowledged as having been wrong. The chief medical officer, Farrar continued, has resigned effective immediately. The investigation into the administrative system breach, the altered document that carried his authorization without his knowledge, has been referred to the hospital's cybersecurity team and law enforcement. He is not implicated in the transfer attempt. He is, however, implicated in a pattern of inadequate oversight that created the conditions for it. Okafor was making notes. The COO had his jaw set in the specific way of someone absorbing institutional failure and doing the work of not externalizing it. On the nursing side, Farrar said. She looked at Emma directly. Deborah Wills has been removed from the charge nurse position pending a full review of her supervisory decisions over the past 3 years. She will remain employed in a staff capacity while that review is completed. She paused. I want to be transparent about this. The evidence against Wills is one of inadequate clinical leadership and suppression of clinical input. It's not the same category as Phelps. The response reflects that. Emma nodded. She understood the distinction. She also understood that Farrar had made it deliberately, which was the kind of precision she respected. Finally, Farrar said, the supervisory review notice filed by Phelps has been removed from your file. The removal is documented. The original filing and its timestamp are preserved in the misconduct record. She folded her hands on the table. I would like to formally apologize on behalf of this institution for the conditions that existed in your employment for 6 years. That apology is inadequate for what it's apologizing for, and I know that. But it's accurate and it's sincere. Emma looked at Farrar. At the table full of people, military, administrative, legal, medical, all oriented toward the same set of facts. She thought about what she'd told Ames in the coffee place 2 days ago. Enough as a moving target, the work not being the same as the institution. I accept the apology, she said, and I'd like to talk about what comes next. Farrar almost smiled. That's what the rest of this meeting is for. The ceremony was scheduled for the following Friday, which gave Marcus 9 days of recovery to get to something approaching upright and presentable, which Okafor considered aggressive and Marcus considered approximately right, and which Emma stayed out of because it was between the two of them and she had enough to manage. The week was not quiet. The federal investigation expanded in ways that reached beyond Holler Creek. The private equity entity that had retained the consultant had threads connecting to 3 other healthcare facilities, and a congressional inquiry that had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of evidentiary hook. Alderman was in and out of the hospital with the regularity of someone whose office had relocated. Emma gave a formal statement on Wednesday, not about Marcus's care, which remained classified at the relevant levels, but about the transfer order and the administrative sequence around it. She gave it in writing, organized by timeline, with the documentation file she'd been keeping attached. The federal attorney who received it read the first 3 pages without looking up, and then asked how long she'd been keeping records like this. Since my 2nd year, Emma said. And no one knew about this file? I didn't tell anyone about it. Why not? She'd thought about this. Because the file was most useful if it was complete, and I couldn't complete it if the people I was documenting knew I was documenting them. She paused. Also, I didn't know what I'd need it for. I just knew something might eventually require it. The attorney looked at her for a moment. That's very disciplined. It's habit, Emma said, from a previous job. On Thursday, Farrar called her into a meeting that had a different quality from the others. Smaller, quieter, with just the COO and the legal counsel, and nobody from outside the institution. We'd like to offer you the position of Director of Trauma Education, Farrar said. It's a role that currently exists on paper without meaningful leadership. We want to rebuild it as a functional department, trauma protocol development, staff training, cross-disciplinary simulation training, collaboration with the emergency and critical care teams. She paused. The salary is significantly above your current band. The role reports directly to the CMO's office, which is currently vacant and being restructured. You would have genuine authority over the curriculum and the protocols. Emma looked at the job description they'd placed in front of her. It was 3 pages, and it was specific, which told her it had been written by someone who understood the job rather than someone performing the act of creating a job. The 18-month-old protocol recommendation I filed, Emma said. The triage protocol for penetrating trauma. It would be the first thing we implement, Farrar said, under your sign-off. Emma sat with that for a moment. Not the title, not the salary. The protocol. 3 cases in 6 months where a different procedure might have changed the outcome, and she'd never been able to prove causation, but she'd known what she'd observed, and now the procedure would exist and future cases would have what those 3 hadn't. I need 2 conditions, Emma said. Name them. The training program includes combat medicine integration, not as an add-on, as a core component. The civilian emergency system has significant gaps that field medicine fills, and I want our staff trained in both directions. Agreed, Farrar said, without hesitation. And I keep my ICU rotation, 1 shift per week minimum. I'm not moving entirely into administration. She paused. I need to stay patient side. Farrar looked at her. May I ask why that's a condition rather than a preference? Emma thought about the vending machine crackers, about a hand moving under hers at 5 in the morning, about Darren, 22 years old, who remembered a voice and not the words. Because the people who designed the training programs I came up through had mostly stopped being in rooms with patients, she said, and it showed. I don't want to become that. Farrar considered this. She looked at the COO, who gave a small nod. 1 shift per week, patient side. Non-negotiable. Agreed, Emma said. She signed the offer letter before she left the building. Friday came with a cold, clear sky. The kind that happened in November when the clouds finally cleared and the light had nowhere to hide. Emma arrived at the hospital at 8:30 in civilian clothes. She'd been told civilian clothes, which was a deliberate choice by Stride that she understood and respected. The auditorium on the 3rd floor had been arranged differently than its usual configuration. The first 4 rows were occupied by uniformed military personnel. Behind them, hospital staff, nurses, physicians, administrative staff. Some of them people Emma had worked alongside for 6 years without ever having a real conversation. The Senate liaison was in the 3rd row. Farrar was in the 2nd. Priya was near the middle of the room and caught Emma's eye and gave her a look that carried more weight than it should have been able to. Dolan was near the front. He was in civilian clothes too. He nodded when she came in, and the nod said everything he'd been saying all week without words, which was that this was correct and appropriate and overdue. She sat in the front row, next to an empty chair. Marcus arrived 8 minutes after she did, which was either the product of careful timing or the particular stubbornness of a man who'd decided he was going to walk in under his own power and had made the physical preparation necessary to do it. He walked with a slight favoring of his right side that would diminish over the coming weeks, and he looked like a man who'd been through something significant and had come out of it without losing whatever it was that had made him who he was. He sat in the chair beside her. "How's the head?" she said. "The soft edge is mostly gone." "Mostly. 90%. He looked at the room. "Is this awkward for you?" "A little," she said honestly. "I'm better in situations where I have a specific job." "You have a specific job here," he said. "What's that?" "Be here." He said it simply, the way he said things. "Sometimes that's the whole job." She thought about that. She decided he wasn't wrong. Well, Stride stood at the front of the room, and the quality of attention in the space changed the way it did when someone who was used to being listened to began to speak. He didn't use notes. He talked about the operation, at the level that the room was cleared to hear, which was the broad shape of it without the specific geography, the category of outcome without the classified details. He talked about what Marcus had been doing for years in the spaces between the things people saw and the cost of it, and what it had made possible for people who would never know his name. Then he talked about the morning Marcus had arrived at Haller Creek. He talked about it accurately, which Emma appreciated more than she would have expected. He didn't dramatize it. He said, "A man arrived in a hospital where he was unknown. He was unconscious. He had no identification, no family, no next of kin. The quality of his survival from that point forward depended on the judgment and commitment of the people in that building. And the person whose judgment and commitment had mattered most, in the first hours, in the overnight, in the small decisions that nobody was watching and nobody was scoring, was a nurse who had been doing her job in an institution that had not adequately recognized what that job was." He said her name. Emma sat still in the front row and let the room know who she was. Stride talked about her record, the army service, the 2 rotations, the specific incident in Kunar province that had been in no document she'd ever seen, but which Stride had apparently located, because he described it with the kind of detail that required a source. He talked about the 6 years at Haller Creek. He talked about the protocol recommendations and the maintenance requests and the documentation files she'd been keeping since year 2 with the same methodical discipline she'd brought to every patient assessment. "She didn't do those things because she expected this moment," Stride said. "She did them because they were the right things to do. That's a distinction that matters, between people who perform the right things when they're observed and people who do them because the work itself requires it." He paused. "The military has a specific understanding of that distinction. It's how we identify people worth trusting with the things that matter most." He called Marcus to the front. Marcus stood. He walked to the front of the room with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body was still in negotiation with the request, and he stood beside Stride, and the room was very quiet. He looked at Emma. "You talked to me when I couldn't answer," he said. "You told me it was safe. You told me my people were there." He paused. "I don't know if I would have found my way back without that. I'm not being poetic, I genuinely don't know. But I know it mattered, and I know that I was a stranger to you, an unidentified patient with no name on a form, and you decided to be present anyway." He stopped. "What you did wasn't dramatic, it was just consistent. Every check, every hour, every conversation that nobody required you to have. Consistent. A beat. I've spent my career in environments where consistent is the rarest thing. It's what keeps people alive." Emma stood when Stride gestured. She walked to the front of the room and she stood there while Stride read a formal commendation that had specific language and specific recognition and would be on record in the specific way that records that mattered were on record. She received a medallion that she looked at and held and didn't perform anything about, because there was nothing to perform. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and placed a challenge coin on top of the medallion in her hand. Not the same one Ames had given her, a different one, older, worn at the edges, with a patina that spoke of years. "That one's mine," he said quietly. "Has been for a long time. I'd like you to have it." She looked at it. She understood what it meant. She closed her hand around both of them. The room began to applaud. She wasn't prepared for the specific quality of it, not the polite institutional sound of a conference room, but the full-body, floor-vibrating sound of a room full of people who meant it. She looked out at Priya and Farrar and Dolan and the rows of uniformed personnel, and she looked at Okafor, who was clapping with the contained intensity of a man who didn't express things easily and was expressing this. And she felt something move through her that she couldn't have named precisely and didn't try. She didn't cry. She also didn't pretend that she wasn't affected, which was its own kind of honesty. In the second row, one of the uniformed personnel stood, then another, then Dolan, then the row behind them, then the room, in the lurching, uncoordinated way that rooms stood when the impulse was genuine rather than choreographed, and people were rising because they needed to rather than because they'd been told to. Emma stood at the front of the room and let it be what it was. The institutional fallout continued for weeks after the ceremony, as these things did. Phelps contested his termination through 3 separate administrative channels and lost all 3. The misconduct record, including the retaliatory filing and his role in facilitating the unauthorized transfer order, was preserved in full. He was referred to the State Medical Board for a license review. The hearing was scheduled for the following spring. The private equity entity that had initiated the transfer attempt was the subject of a federal investigation that named 4 individuals at the organization level. 2 of them resigned before charges were filed, and 2 did not. The congressional inquiry that had been running parallel to all of it expanded to include the healthcare facilities connected to the board. An alderman testified before a Senate subcommittee in December. The chief medical officer retired. The formal finding was that he had not been complicit in the transfer attempt, but had operated his office with insufficient oversight of the administrative systems under his authority, creating the conditions for the breach. It was not a criminal finding. It was not nothing either. Deborah Wills's supervisory review took 6 weeks. The finding was that she had consistently suppressed clinical input from a staff nurse with superior qualifications, had created a hostile supervisory environment, and had failed to escalate patient safety concerns that were within her authority to escalate. She was not terminated. Farrar had been accurate about the distinction between her conduct and Phelps. She was permanently moved out of charge nurse functions and placed in a staff position without supervisory authority. She filed a grievance. The grievance was reviewed and denied with documentation that consisted largely of Emma's 6-year file, which was thorough enough that the denial took 4 pages. Emma didn't attend those proceedings. She didn't need to. She'd done her part when she'd kept the file. The rest was the institution doing the work of being accountable, which was its job, and she let it do that job without inserting herself. She started the Director of Trauma Education role on December 1st, which was earlier than originally planned because Farrar's version of timeline management was apparently compressed relative to most people's. The office was a real office, not a converted supply room, not a desk in a shared space, a room with a window that looked out over the parking lot, which wasn't a scenic view, but it had light and she could see the sky. The first thing she did was print the penetrating trauma triage protocol and put it on the wall. Not framed, just taped up, so she'd see it every time she looked up from her desk and remember what the job was for. The second thing she did was call the combat medicine training specialist she'd known from her second rotation, a man named Rourke, who'd left the Army 6 years before she had and had been working in civilian emergency medicine training since, and who picked up the phone with the immediate recognition of someone who'd kept track. She told him what she was building. He said he'd been waiting for someone to build it. They scheduled a meeting for the following week. The third thing she did was update her maintenance request for Bay 7. This time, she put it in person, directly to the new facilities manager, a woman who'd been promoted into the role 2 weeks earlier and who read the 8 outstanding requests and looked up with the expression of someone who intended to act. Bay 7 got new lighting by mid-December. It was a small thing. It was also not a small thing. 7 requests over 6 years, and then 1 request delivered in person to the right person at the right moment, and the lights stopped flickering. Emma thought about that sometimes. The way systems worked and didn't work. The way the same effort, directed at different points, produced completely different outcomes. She thought about it not with bitterness. She'd moved through the bitterness during year 3, but with the practical interest of someone who was now in a position to redesign some of the points. Marcus was discharged on December 12th, 11 days after the projected date, which was behind schedule for a civilian recovery and aggressively fast for what he'd actually sustained. He walked out the front entrance of Holler Creek Medical Center on his own feet, with Dolan on his right and Reyes on his left, and 2 other members of his team behind them, and he stopped at the entrance and turned and looked back at the building with an expression Emma, watching from the second-floor window of her new office, couldn't read from that distance. She saw him say something to Dolan. She saw Dolan look up toward the building, scan the floors, find the window she was standing at. She raised a hand. Dolan nudged Marcus. Marcus looked up. He raised a hand back, which, at his stage of recovery, was a deliberate physical act and not a casual gesture, and she understood exactly how much that cost and what it meant. They got in the vehicle and drove away. She kept in touch with Dolan through the winter. Not frequently. That wasn't the kind of contact their acquaintance produced, but periodically, in the specific way of people whose connection had been formed in compressed high-stakes conditions and who'd found that it persisted into ordinary time. He texted once in January to say that Marcus had been cleared for light physical activity, which was earlier than the rehab team had projected, and which Dolan communicated with the specific dryness of someone who had stopped being surprised. In February, Marcus called her himself. It was a Wednesday evening. She was in her kitchen with a half-finished dinner and a training curriculum outline she'd been revising for the 3rd time. The call came from a number she didn't have saved but recognized the area code of. "How's the soft edge?" she said. "Completely gone," he said. "My reaction time is back to baseline." Okafor will want to know that. "Already told him." A pause. "How's the department?" "Building," she said. "The first combat medicine module runs in March. Rourke is running the practical component." "Rourke," he said, and she could hear the recognition in it. "He's good." "He is." She moved the curriculum outline to the side. "How are you?" A pause that held something she'd learned to read as him deciding how honest to be. "Different," he said, "than before." He said it without elaboration, which was its own kind of elaboration. "Different is usually what's left after something like this," she said. "Is it better?" She thought about what she would have said 6 months ago. She thought about Bay 7 and the files she'd kept since year 2 and the flickering lights that had finally been fixed. She thought about standing at the front of a room holding 2 challenge coins while 100 people stood because they meant it. "It depends on what you do with it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I think that's the right answer." "I think so too." They talked for 40 minutes, not about anything classified, not about the investigation or the ceremony or the institutional fallout, about the training curriculum, about the gaps in civilian trauma care that combat medicine filled, and the gaps in combat medicine that civilian care filled. About a patient she'd had in January who'd reminded her, in a specific technical way, of the LMTV. About what he was moving toward, which he described with the tentative precision of someone who had a direction but not yet a clear road. When the call ended, she sat at the kitchen table for a while. She thought about the things she hadn't been able to name during the ceremony, when the room had stood and the sound had been real and she'd felt something move through her. She thought she could name it now. It wasn't vindication exactly, though that was part of it. It wasn't recognition, though that was part of it too. It was the feeling of having done the right thing in the right way for the right reasons, in the dark, over a long time, without anyone watching or keeping score, and then having the world eventually catch up to that fact. Not because the world was just. The world wasn't reliably just, and she'd known that long enough to not expect it. But because she'd been consistent, because she'd documented, because she'd talked to an unconscious man about vending machine crackers at 1 a.m. and called an attending physician when a transfer document had a wrong signature and kept a file since year 2 and asked to be in the conversation at the beginning, not the end, because she'd done her job. Every time. Even when it cost something. Even when no one saw. The curriculum outline was still on the table. She pulled it back toward her and read where she'd left off. There was a section on triage decision-making under resource constraint that needed another pass. The language was close but not quite right, not concrete enough, not drawn enough from actual experience rather than theoretical framework. She picked up her pen and started over from the top of the section. Outside, the February night was doing what February did, cold and long and utterly indifferent to the people inside the buildings doing the work that kept things going. Somewhere across the city, people were sick and scared and waiting for someone to walk in and know what to do. Somewhere, a nurse was on hour 11 of a 12-hour shift, running on the specific fuel of competence and commitment that nobody had formally recognized, and that didn't require recognition to keep burning. Emma knew who those people were. She used to be one of them, except she'd never stopped. The room with the window, the title on the badge, the curriculum on the table, those were new. What she was doing was the same, what she had always been doing. The pen moved across the page. She'd learned a long time ago, in a field hospital in a valley she still wasn't supposed to name, that the work didn't announce itself. It didn't ask for witnesses. It didn't wait for the right conditions or the right institution or the right supervisor to sign off. It just needed someone willing to do it, quietly, consistently, in the dark, in the flickering light, in the back of a moving vehicle, if that was what the situation required. It needed someone who understood that showing up completely, without recognition and without guarantee, was not a sacrifice. It was the whole point.